So, tonight we're going to have a look at some images of Ypres in the 1950s and 60s. And this is from a collection that's never been seen before. And it came to me through one of our Ledger Battlefield guides, one of my team of guides who works with me, Mark Hope. And I think one of you has just come back from a tour with him. And Mark was on a tour about a year and a bit ago, and a passenger brought these with him, didn't know what to do with them, gave them to Mark, and Mark very kindly gave them to me. And he said, you'll do something with them, I'm sure. And finally, a year or so later, I've got round to scanning them, having a look at them, and thinking about what we can do. So before we get to that, though, let's kind of just have a bit of an overview. So Ypres, sacrificial ground, we could call it, at the very heart of the British and Commonwealth experience of the First World War. It was the first main sector that British and Commonwealth troops occupied in that first winter of the First World War of 1914-15, when a mobile war went static and trenches were dug, forming what became known as the Ypres salient. And we've got a map, contemporary map, showing a bit of that in 1915, with the city of Ypres in the kind of epicenter of the battlefield, surrounded by all these villages that would become almost household names during the First World War, and surrounded as well by a whole series of ridges forming this kind of semicircular bit of high ground, which is what the salient is really, this arc of ground on which the Germans sat for 2 years, from the end of the Second Battle of Ypres in May 1915 through to the beginning of the Third Battle of Ypres in July of 1917, totally dominating the battlefield. And really, to understand the war in Flanders, the war around Ypres, is an understanding of how terrain and landscape, which we talk about very, very often on the podcast, how important that is on the battlefield. And really, this whole war in Flanders becomes a battle for the possession and repossession of so-called high ground. And when we talk about these ridges like the Frasenberg Ridge or the Bellewaerde Ridge or the Brunzeinde Ridge or the Pilkelm Ridge and all these other ridges, we're talking about ridges that are just tens of meters above sea level. When you stand on that ground just short of Passchendaele at Tynecourt Cemetery today, you're only 38 meters above sea level, but you can see for miles and miles across that relatively flat landscape. And that is a key to understanding it as well, that any dominance, any occupation of these so-called bits of high ground will give whoever is on them the advantage. And that's what the war here really was very much about. In terms of imagery of Ypres, we've kind of looked at this on and off quite a few times, and I'm sure it's something that we will return to. It's something that eternally fascinates me since I picked up my very first contemporary postcards of Ypres, which I bought in a shop in Ypres when I first went there in 1982. And we see in this pre-war, probably from about 1910 to 1912 postcard, a typical image of what the pre-war view of Ypres would have been like. It was described in the Baedeker's guide as a medieval gem of Europe, this incredible medieval city preserved within its walls. It was almost as if time had stood still, and dominated by key public buildings like this one, the Cloth Hall, where in medieval times this was the heart, the centre of the medieval cloth trade, and each one of those little doors with the arch window above it was a place where there was a cloth stall where cloth would be sold by different vendors from all over Europe and then distributed all over Europe by the canal system that existed in that part of Europe at that time. So this incredible city suddenly in October 1914 found itself on the sharp end of those early months of the Great European War, as it was called then. And German troops, a cavalry patrol, was photographed by one of the local photographers, Anthony of Ypres, coming into this part of Ypres. And the Germans, that's as far as they got. For the rest of the 4 years of the First World War, they attempted so many times to break through, got very close to it in April 1918 with the front line at Hellfire Corner, just to the east of the city, less than a mile from where this photograph was taken. But of course, it changed this landscape forever, 4 years of war. And in that first Battle of Ypres, of which there were four battles of Ypres, the first Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914 saw the end of the War of Movement. The War of Movement, the war which everyone had gone to war to fight. We often talk about armies and approach to fighting, the beginning of the First World War. It's clear that everyone was prepared for war, just not the kind of war that this rapidly turned into. And you see in those opening months the attempts of both sides to fight that war of movement, to advance across vast open fields with white gloved officers and swords and cavalry and everything that had gone before. But the world had changed, technology had changed, weaponry had changed, and it made those players on the battlefields far more vulnerable. And that was shown very, very strongly in those opening battles of the Great War, when artillery and shrapnel and machine guns caused such horrific casualties to all of those who came in the path of them. So by the time the British Army, having fought at Mons and retreated that great distance down to near Paris to fight in the Marne and on the Aisne in September of 1914, and then marched northwards to Flanders and around La Bassée and fought in those areas in October 1914, by the time it did that, it was already now becoming used to digging trench systems, not joined up as they became, these kind of isolated trenches like this one we can see in many of the Scots Guards near Zandvoorde. This is a photograph by Corporal Pilkington, who was a soldier in the Artist Rifles who went to war attached to the Scots Guards and also carried a camera with him and took some of the most potent images of that early phase of the war when there were no official photographers. So this is the kind of result of the end of that first phase of the First World War, where both sides begin to dig in. And in Flanders, this trench system develops as it did along 450 miles of the Western Front, resulting in the landscape gradually being eroded, if you like, by that fighting, and leading to official images that show us some of the kind of apocalyptic views of what these battlefields of the Great War were like. This is a stretch of the Menin Road at Hellfire Corner, which will be a bit of a theme. A shot taken very close to this spot will be a bit of a theme in this talk, particularly towards the end. And then we get to, the end of the war, and cities like Ypres are devastated. I mean, it looks like the ruins of an ancient civilization, but just a few years before it had been this medieval gem. The landscape was destroyed, the landscape was torn apart. The city of Ypres was in ruins and its people scattered far and wide. And it would take many, many years for that to be put right. The building we can see in this image, the Cloth Hall, which we saw on that pre-war image, took until 1962 for that to be finally kind of completed, if you like, renovated to what it had looked like before the war. And at the back, to the left of this image, we can see the archway of St Martin's Cathedral that was also rebuilt. And when it was rebuilt, a taller spire was put on it. So this was the next phase, the kind of aftermath of the First World War, as this landscape recovered from 4 years of fighting, and the buildings and the farms and the road systems were all rebuilt. The woods naturally regrew, and the landscape, as much as it could, recovered. But just a generation later, war came again. And we often talk about how the First World War meets the Second World War on these battlefields of the old front line. And this is an image I think I've shown before, but it's always worth showing again. It's one of quite a number I have taken of the old First World War battlefields during the Second World War. So this is actually a German soldier's photograph of a abandoned and sabotaged, by the look of it, abandoned British truck of the 5th Infantry Division that was in the retreat to Dunkirk 85 years ago. So this is an image from 85 years ago, from May 1940, and it's taken in front of the US 27th and 30th Division Memorial, which is on the Ypres to Kemmel Road, just to the south of Ypres, where those two American divisions, doughboys who fought in Flanders, were in August and September of 1918 before they moved down to the Somme to take part in the advance on the Hindenburg Line. And I'm mindful of this as I kind of bring this introductory bit to a conclusion, that the images that we're about to see that date from the 1950s and 60s are taken really only a short time after this photograph was taken in May of 1940. And it shows how, I guess, the lens and the photographer changes as much as the landscape itself. And I think that's an important kind of consideration as well. So what are these images then? Well, I inherited these, as I say, from my good friend Mark Hope, who very kindly passed them over to me. And it's a pile of about 60 photographs that are mounted, as you can see in this image here, mounted for a kind of an exhibition. Now, I don't know that he ever exhibited them in any great public space. The photographer, whose name I don't know, it's not on any of the images. He has indexed the back of the images. He's put captions on there. He's put photographic details, what his f-stop was, what shutter speed was, and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know who he was. He's a good photographer, very good, and I guess he probably printed these himself and mounted them up. Whether he was a member of a photographic club and he did this as a kind of side project to show at the photographic club, I don't know, but he certainly went to some effort really to get these properly mounted up, and they've been sat in someone's shed, in someone's loft, whatever, for years. A bit of foxing on some of them, as you can see, but they are generally in fairly good condition. Now, he was a photographer rather than a war photographer, rather than a battlefield photographer. And quite a lot of the images show rural scenes, with cows in the fields and farmers going about their work. And there's no discernible kind of evidence of anything First World War in the background. He just saw the shot. He could see something in that. And those are good photographs, but they don't necessarily tell us a lot about the battlefields of the First World War. So I haven't included any of those. So what we're going to see tonight is a selection of about 28, 29 of these images that show us something of that landscape of the old front line, that culture of the old front line, and hopefully we'll kind of get something from that by seeing the battlefields as they were in this period. Now, I've called this Ypres in the 1950s and 60s. I have a feeling this might be the result, these photographs might be the result of quite a few trips over possibly quite a few years. And certainly there's kind of indications that some of them are definitely in the 50s, and others, I think, like the one of Ypres there, is almost certainly in the 60s, simply because of the completion of the cloth hall, which, as we mentioned, wasn't finished until 1962. But that's a kind of overview. And I'm sitting here with them now myself. I've got a few of them here, right alongside me. But we're going to drill down now into some of them and see what they tell us about the landscape of the old front line in Flanders. And I've kind of constructed this journey. He didn't do this. They're not numbered or in any kind of order. If they were in an order, sadly, they've been jumbled up over the years. So I don't really know what order he wanted to put them in. But I've put them in a little bit of a journey and order for us. And we're coming into Ypres on the Popperinga Road, as so many soldiers did during the Great War. We've got Popperinga behind us, Ypres round the bend, and this is the asylum, the Ypres asylum on the left-hand side. And it's a complete copy of the original building that was there. It is a lunatic asylum, and it was used during the Great War as a dressing station. There were medical facilities in there. They took over this big structured building, perfect for the treatment of wounded, and many field ambulances had their field ambulance, their ADS or the MDS, main dressing station or advanced dressing station, there during the Great War. There was a cemetery here as well called the Asylum Cemetery, and that was an important battlefield cemetery. But it was decided when the war was over that because it had that name and because of where it was, perhaps the families of those buried in there might have some confusion, some fear as to how their loved ones had died. Might they have died in an asylum? And, for a generation of parents who were Victorians, that had a lot of connotations, none of which were very good. So a decision was made to close that cemetery and move it elsewhere. So there's no war cemetery there today. it's just out of view, and it's a shame that we can't quite see it. But on the right-hand side of the road, just beyond that parked car that's there, there is a row of cottages. And a few years ago, they peeled back a covering, a kind of tiled covering on the end of that row of cottages, revealing a British Legion sign for the pilgrims of Ypres, telling them where to go to get their wreaths and to get information. And that would have been there when this photograph was taken. Possibly the tiles were already covering it, and that aspect of Ypres past, at least for that moment, to become a bit of a ghost. But this is going to bring us into the battlefields, and we're going to go out into some different parts of it through these photographs. For most people who saw this, they would just see a big public building in Europe somewhere, possibly, it's got Flemish, um, French kind of style architecture. But for us, knowing the symbolism of the importance of it, I think this kind of brings us into that battle area. And then we're going to come round, and the first group of little photographs are all taken near the Lille Gate. And this is something we've discussed on the Old Frontline YouTube channel recently with a couple of videos looking at the ramparts and the area around the Lille Gate itself. It's such an atmospheric location. It's changed an awful lot. I mean, in my time, and when I look at this, I can see changes that I never knew. So we're now on the ramparts, very close to the Rampart Cemetery, and this image almost certainly is taken from there. I would guess on a slightly long lens because he zoomed in a little bit there, and we can see part of the moat and the bridge from the Lille Gate itself out towards the battlefields to the south, so out towards Messines. This is very different today because there's a big roundabout just beyond where the curve of the road there, and some of these buildings were demolished quite relatively recently, 20 years ago, to make way for the road improvements and to make way for the new roundabout. And just behind that tall building that we can see there, which is almost certainly a cafe, I can see a provisional house, one of the houses that was put up around Ypres just after the First World War, when the refugees that had fled Ypres, some had gone to France, some had gone up into the Netherlands, they began to return and they needed somewhere to live. And this whole kind of shanty town of these provisional houses were constructed around the city, on the edge of the city, because the city itself was being cleared, ready for rebuilding. And there's one of those kind of still nestled there in this photograph. Now, to my knowledge, I mean, there's very few of these left on the Flanders landscape, which is pretty tidy, pretty organised, and pretty clean in so many good and positive ways. But older structures that are a bit ramshackle tend not to survive. But there is one just to the northeast of Ypres on the Ypres St Jan Road near to the White House Cemetery. And I just got some emails for them from someone who listened to the podcast the other day about these kind of provisional houses. So there's still a few out. There's more in France than there is in Flanders, but it's another important little aspect of Ypres history that we see on these kind of photographs. And then this is taken from the back of the Rampart Cemetery, and you can see in this image that this guy was a clever, skillful photographer. It's a beautiful photograph. He's captured it well in black and white. The light is fantastic. We can see it kind of glimmering on the moat there. It's the contrast of a peaceful scene. There's someone in a little boat fishing or just kind of boating up the moat of Ypres in front of the ramparts, which is kind of, I suppose, juxtaposed with the fact that we're looking also at the headstones of soldiers who died in one of the most horrific wars that Europe had ever seen. And I think that's the contrast of all of these silent cities, the way they are themselves part of that landscape and sit there. I don't think as kind of as mute witnesses, far from mute, really. They're places where I think you can tune into so many different aspects of the First World War. But you can see why this particular cemetery is, I think beloved is perhaps the wrong word, but certainly is a place that people like to go to when they're there because of its beauty, because of its serenity, because of the fact that there you are looking out onto the battlefields, and these guardians of Ypres are there for all time with their names cast in stone, looking out across that battlefield. And you can see as well, I think, just in this one image, why someone like Rose Coombs was so keen to have her ashes scattered here because it was a place that meant so much to her, and where those pathways, those crisscross pathways of the war, of remembrance and everything else kind of all came together. And it's a place that you can go to. Ypres is often a busy city, particularly at armistice time when it's close to the 11th of November. There's a lot of people there come to remember and take part in the parades. Parades aren't for everybody, and this is a place to come to get a bit of quiet, to contemplate and to think and connect, I think, in so many different ways as we often do in these cemeteries. And this is from just the other side of the Lille Gate itself. So this is going back round the ramparts, back towards the Menin Gate. And we're looking now down across the moat. It's quite wide at this particular point. If you've never been up onto this part of the ramparts, if you've been to Ypres before, it's well worth going to. We can see the kind of smashed state of the ramparts on the left-hand side there, how damaged the walls still are, you know, half a century nearly after the Great War. There was a big renovation project of the ramparts in the 90s, and a lot of those shell holes, the impacts of which of the kind of shells that struck these walls, we can see on this photograph, were filled in and smoothed out. I'm not sure whose decision that was, but I'm not sure it was ever the wisest one that the Burgermeister or the Council of Ypres ever made. But in this, again, that's the importance of these kind of photographs, is that they give us that snapshot of the past and what these landscapes once looked like. And that little road that we can see there with its little trees that line it is looking out to the battlefields just to the southeast of Ypres. So we're looking towards Zillebeek. Zillebeek Lake is off to the right. Hellfire Corner off to the left in the far distance. There's a big youth stadium here now, kind of sports stadium, and there's a camping area just at the back of this. There's a big furniture shop. The Crack furniture shop is in this area, and there's a football stadium just up here as well. So it's, if you took this today, it would be a very, very different kind of view, and again, kind of shows how in just, you know, another half century, the city of Ypres has evolved and changed again. And this is from further round. So he's kind of, again, I don't know what order he did these in, but we've gone from the Lille Gate round to that big expanse of water just beyond it, now to the section which is in the kind of final approaches towards the Menin Gate. And here we're looking down into the ramparts. We can see some people fishing on the far side, where the little bridge is that comes across into one of the sally ports. That's just off to the left of where these people are sitting. And in those days, there was no bridge. That bridge was not placed or replaced until, again, the 1990s, around about 2000. So that old bridge that had been put in place, and a bridge had been constructed there by the Royal Engineers during the Great War, that was not part of the post-war or even the post-Second World War Ypres. To get to where those people are sitting, you had to go out either the Little Gate or the Menin Gate and walk all the way round. It's only in recent times that we can kind of get out into these places. And if you look in the background, that modern building we can see there, I think, is the beginning of the Jugstadion, the sports centre that's there. And the water tower that we can see in the background there is right up on the Menin Road. So that's a junction on the Menin Road, where to the left the White Chateau was located, and Menin Road South Cemetery is in that area, and to the right of that water tower, that continues up towards Hellfire Corner itself. And between us and where that water tower is, during the Great War, and it was never rebuilt, was the École de Bienfaisance, which was a girls' school, which, again, being a big kind of public building with a lot of rooms, well laid out, was taken over by medical units and used as a dressing station. And, you know, there's no trace of that 50 years after the war, because there was perilously little trace of it in the immediate post-war world. But again, we're seeing evidence, and that's the value of these photographs, evidence of the changing landscape. And then coming out of Ypres onto the battlefields themselves, we've come down to Transport Farm Cemetery, which is just to the south of Ypres. And we can see the spires of Ypres in the background there. The church spire standing alone, that is St. Jack's Church, which is very near to the Menin Gate. And the spires you can see to the left, of course, the Cloth Hall, that big building in the centre of Ypres, and St Martin's Cathedral. So we're looking back into the city that way. The Menin Gate was to the right of the single-spired church, so we're kind of looking at to that part of the city of Ypres. And to the right of the entranceway to Transport Farm is the approach to Zillebeek Lake, where there were gun sites during the war. It's the main route up to the front line at Zillebeek, and beyond that to Observatory Ridge and Hill 62 and Sanctuary Wood, Maple Copse, and all those kind of places where British troops served. And then Canadians were there in the early summer of 1916. And this cemetery is a very much a burial ground that reflects that bit of the battlefield from the area just to the south of Sanctuary Wood and Observatory Ridge, and then across to Hill 60. And there's a lot of Hill 60 casualties buried in here. And there are both divisional plots, regimental battalion plots in here, and then some later graves. And this area, the cemetery that's photographed here, are the post-war concentrations. And as you come up through the entrance, and these little headstones we can see either side of the photograph are circular patterns of headstones, which are in fact special memorials. So they are headstones that commemorate men known to be buried in the cemetery, but due to shell fire and the passage of the war, the exact location of their grave is not known. And that's quite a large number in this part of the Transport Farm Cemetery. Just out of view, I think slightly obscured by the cemetery entrance there is quite a big British bunker out in the fields there, which was a signals bunker built by the Royal Engineers sometime in around about 1916. It's one of a number in the same pattern, almost certainly built by the same Royal Engineer unit, and they were built for gun battery sites that were there so they could have their signals headquarters and their battery headquarters or brigade headquarters in there, and it would be a lot safer than them being in a dugout or a timber frame structure on the same battlefield. And when they were built, the concrete, of course, was still wet, and they pushed sandbags into the side of it to give it an extra layer of protection. The sandbags have long since rotted away, so when you see that bunker, it's got like a kind of honeycomb effect in it from where the sandbags once were, but unfortunately we can't quite see that. If you go there today, you will see it. And then going a little bit further south away from Ypres, we've come to Bedford House Cemetery, and he picked some very picturesque silent cities, burial grounds to go and photograph. And this is one of the enclosures of Bedford House Cemetery. It's an unusual cemetery built around the grounds of a chateau, Bedford House. It had a number of names. Chateau Rosendahl was another one. Had quite a few names during the war, and again used because it was a big building, had rooms, had cellars. It was used by medical units as a dressing station for casualties coming back from the Ypres Canal sector, the southern Ypres Canal sector. So this is not the Yser Canal, it's the Commune Canal. And that cut right through the middle of a position known as the Bluff. So casualties coming back from the Bluff were brought for treatment here. And the 47th London Division, who spent quite a lot of time here in 1916, and then again they returned in the lead up to the Battle of Messines in the first half of 1917, put in a lot of the infrastructure in this area, including making a permanent dressing station here, concrete in some parts of it, and then putting concrete bunkers in several areas around the canal itself, some of which you can see. They've cleared out one bit of the canal, and you can see some of those concrete structures in some of the locks on this side of the canal before you get up to where the Bluff and the front lines once were. When I first went to Bedford House myself, which would have been either on my first or second trip to Ypres, I can't remember which, so 82, 83, quite a long time ago, it still looked like this. And these trees that we see in this photograph would have been mature trees by then. And then a decision was made a couple of decades ago by the commission to remove a lot of large trees from these cemeteries because they were causing damage to the headstones. The roots were taking hold, and of course, there's all kinds of problems with that. And I can understand all the reasons for doing it, but it kind of changed, I think, the atmosphere of these cemeteries. And there are many of which the top of that list would be Courcelette British Cemetery that have trees in them today that make them what they are in all kinds of ways, and make them part of that wider landscape in which they sit, that I often wonder every time I leave them, when I come back next time, will it have changed? Will the trees have gone? Because it does change the atmosphere, I think, within these cemeteries. I mean, there are considerations of maintenance and all that kind of stuff, but I do feel that the natural world, which was the intention of incorporating that natural world into these cemeteries from the very beginning of making them permanent, is something that really should remain a very, very important part of it. And I would love to see the War Graves Commission appoint somebody who was a specialist in that area to kind of really keep the natural world in these places, not just in France and Flanders, but across the world. A very challenging job if anyone was going to take it. But anyway, Bedford House, really important cemetery, made up of these enclosures. So different kind of mini cemeteries, cemeteries within a cemetery, covering different periods of the war, kind of reflecting the fighting in this southern part of Ypres, with static periods of trench warfare, big trench raids. So there's a lot of men in here, for example, from the 18th, 1st 18th Battalion London Regiment, London Irish Rifles, who made a big trench raid near the Bluff in April 1917. There's quite a few of their casualties in there. And there's quite a lot from the Battle of Messines. And then some of the earlier cemeteries that were closed and moved into here after the war, because it was a curious thing where they kept most of the original enclosures, and that made the bulk of the post-war permanent cemetery, moved a couple of the enclosures elsewhere, bizarrely, and then brought in graves from a wider area to be buried there. And one of the veterans I often talk about on the podcast, Malcolm Vivian, one of his cousins, who was an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, also a Vivian, is buried in this headstone, in this cemetery, with a headstone with Vivian on it, of course, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and it's very close to kind of a bit of the moat for the chateau. And that's one thing that is not in this set of photographs. I'd like to think that he photographed it because it's picturesque, but he hasn't done a picture. I don't have a picture of a moat, even if he took it. But it is today, that moat is still a very, very kind of atmospheric place, and the remains of the chateau, bits of the chateau are still there. Talking of which, this is one photograph that he did take with a bit of the moat, but not, I would call it, a particularly picturesque one. But it's looking at the remains of this chateau, and this was pretty much unchanged when I first went there in the 80s. And you could see this kind of stepped part of the chateau, which was the steps going up to the main building. And I'm just gonna, you can see there's a Suffolk Regiment headstone in the corner there. That's one of the enclosures close to the kind of island bit of where the moat is. If you've been there, there used to be a little balustrade bridge coming up onto it. You have to walk round one of the plots to get onto it now, and they've put another little bridge at the back to get you into the next enclosure, and then you can walk through to where the chateau is. It's still there. And this is a kind of zooming in bit of it, so we can see the step nature of the what's left of the building, and then the building would have sat higher up on top of that with these big kind of bay windows, and I think it was a tower. It's quite an amazing looking structure. I've seen one post-war image of it and then some wartime drawings of it. But when I first went here with my school, and so I can't remember if it was 82 or 83, I remember going up to this, and there's they look to be either kind of two doors off of a tractor or a bit of something with some glass in piled up against the right hand part of that building. And that was some steps down into a cellar. And when we went there as students, and those things weren't there, we could look down and see the water, and there was something floating on the water, and it was a dish, an aluminium dish. And at the time, we just thought, it was the remains of someone's lunch. They've had a steak and kidney pie in there and just chuck that in there. And years later, when I obviously acquired a little bit more knowledge about the First World War, it was in fact, I realised, a kidney-shaped dish, and almost certainly was an instrument dish for used by the medics who would have been there during the Great War, but long since disappeared. And for a while, I thought that the commission or someone had torn down what was left of this chateau because it was becoming a bit dangerous. But a couple of years ago, when we did a tour where we worked in conjunction with the War Graves Commission, they took us round to this, and it's tucked away at the back, so you can see this even today. It's pretty much unchanged, and they have workshops there now, and they have a horticultural area there as well. And when we went, they gave us a very good lecture on worms, the importance of worms in their gardening. and what worms mean to fertile soil and how they can help the cemeteries look in the way that they do. Fascinating. But what I remember of it, again, some years after I first went there and I got to know various people in Ypres, there used to be a mortuary at the back of this. It was the main mortuary for human remains found on the battlefields around Ypres. And because the Ypres office was also responsible for Germany and the whole of the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries, when cemeteries were closed or when bodies were found there, they were sometimes brought down to the mortuary here at Ypres and kept there before reburial. Because at that time there was only a small number of cemeteries that were still open for burial. So if anyone found in Belgium would be taken to Cement House Cemetery near Langemark, for example. And I got to know the guy who was the chief exhumations officer in those days, who was a Second World War veteran, and he'd been doing this job for many, many years. And it was something that deeply affected him. But they, in those days, of course, recovered remains with almost nothing on them to say who they were, and it's long before DNA. So the vast majority were reburied as unknown soldiers. So we're moving a little bit further south down onto the Messines Ridge now, and here we are at Messines Cemetery, looking towards the very, very distinct spire of Messines Church. This will always be a part of the battlefields that were special to me because of those months that we spent there with Simon Verdigam filming the work that he did with his team of archaeologists excavating this battlefield when a whole system of water pipes were put in here in 2012, resulting in additional graves to this cemetery when the bodies of soldiers, including a New Zealand soldier, were found very close to where the New Zealanders had made their attack in June of 1917, and then were added to this cemetery. But what we see, and we're going to see this in some of the other pictures of the cemeteries, what we see is what was the plantation style at that time, which, as you can see, was quite dense. There's a lot of different plants and shrubs and bushes and trees. It is very much part of that natural world. And that changed in the first decade that I visited these places. It changed. There was a kind of drawing in of that, and the budget that the commission had shrunk, and the number of plants were massively reduced in the 90s, going up towards the kind of turn of that next century into this century. And it's come full circle, of course, because if you go there now, you'll see exactly this kind of approach. So that is a positivity that's kind of gone full circle, and we see the natural world, very much a part of it. But as I was saying earlier, I'd very much like that to continue because I think it's so important. Now, he's come down the road a little bit now from Messines Cemetery, and we're now on the road that goes to Wolvergam, the next little village where Bruce Bairnsfather, the cartoonist, was in that early period of the First World War before he came up to the line. And we're looking right across, literally across the old front line here, because the Germans were up on the slopes of the ridge ahead. Those are the slopes of the Messines Ridge itself. The dip to the right of the road was no man's land. British front line was just to the right. There's a line of trees. It's out of shot there. That's very close to where the British front line was. And I don't know whether he knew this, but it is a really important part of this sector of the Messines Ridge because this is one of the locations where the Christmas truce was in 1914 in this very field on the right. This is where the Cheshire Regiment came out, and they were, thanks to the work of Taff Gillingham, he was the advisor for it. You may remember that Sainsbury's advert for Christmas 2014, where they made the kind of bars of chocolate as part of it as well. And it told the story of the Christmas truce and the football game or game of football. It was kick around really here. But if there was ever a location where there was some evidence of some degree of a football doing something, it was in this field. So it's an important little location. And jumping on a year, one of the other kind of perhaps lesser known stories of this, jumping on a year, this is a field as well, where on the 25th of December 1915, the 16th Battalion of the Canadian Infantry, the Canadian Scottish, attempted to have a truce with the Bavarian soldiers who were opposite them at that time. Now, this is a year after the truce. On a lot of parts of the British front line, there was instructions to bombard no man's land so that a truce could not take place. But here, the Canadians attempted to have it because for the Canadians, this was their first Christmas on the Western Front. And I guess just as those men in 1914 wanted to do something. Not all of them, of course, but some did. These Canadians wanted to do the same, but there wasn't much evidence that old Jerry, old Fritz on the other side of no man's land felt the same way. So the truce never happened here in 1915. There was an attempt, there were shots fired, people went to ground, and the truce, in inverted commas, never really became anything in this sector or any sector. There was no 1915 Christmas truce. The war had moved on. Hundreds of thousands of casualties in that year. Perhaps no one had a stomach for standing in no man's land and shaking each other by the hand. The war was very different. It was now that industrial war, that total war, and the landscape was very different to what it had been a year before. And taken from a very similar kind of area, he's now looking in a different direction. So Messines is to the left, and the ridge is on the ridge now. So Messines town, village, it is actually the smallest town in Belgium. It's to the left of here, Wolvergem, where Bairnsfather was, and first village just behind the British front line in this sector is to the right. And that ridge line we can see there is on the kind of border between Belgium and France. And the church spire, which is on the left-hand part of the photograph, is Neuvy-Église, again another place associated with Bruce Bairnsfather, where he was billeted with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment during that winter of 1914-15. And I can just see it. You won't see it, I don't think, but I can just see it to the far right in the distance, in the misty distance. I can see the spire of Balliol Town Hall. And that's just across the border. Balliol was a town just across the border in France, the main billeting town for this southern part of Ypres. When units were in the line here, British and Commonwealth units, when they came out of the line, they didn't go to Popperinga, they didn't go to the camps there, they went to Balliol, just across the border. And that's where all the wounded were sent and the sick, and units were rotated through there. So it was a really important part of the soldiers' experience in this southern sector of Flanders fields. And this image, again, kind of encapsulates the landscape as it was then. It's not as vast and as open as northern France, but I think there is, even today, if we compared this, we wouldn't see quite as many trees and bushes perhaps as there is on this image. And they've thinned it out. One of my favourite tree-lined avenues is just off to the left from here, and that was chopped down a couple of years ago, sadly. So landscapes are always changing. And we're coming now down to the very southern part of the battlefields, and we're very close to Plugstert or Plug Street Wood. And it took me a while to kind of figure out where this was when I first looked at it. I forgot actually that there were pencil inscriptions on the back of it. So I was sitting there puzzling where this was, realised, and then turned it over, and there was the name of it. It's Prowse Point. So that's Prowse Point, the entrance to Prowse Point Cemetery on the right-hand side there. And the curve of the road goes up to another curve of the road where it does a sharp right into the village or the hamlet of Saint Yvonne. And we're in Bairnsfather territory once more, because the field to the left is where the Warwicks were on Christmas Day 1914, and where he went out in his goatskin jerkin and met the Hun in no man's land. And I've done a kind of a zoom in on this so you can see it. So you can see slightly better on the right. I haven't edited any of these images to kind of bring them out. I think it was just worth scanning them as he developed them, essentially. But we can see the entrance to the cemetery on the right there. You can see some black and white poles with signs on the top, and they are Imperial War Graves Commission signs, which were put up to indicate where the cemeteries were, with the cast iron cemetery signs on them, with the logo of the IWGC, the Imperial War Graves Commission, and then raised lettering in white. They were green, and then the lettering was in white, indicating the name of the cemetery. These were all taken down about the time that he's photographing these landscapes, because the commission was evolving from an Imperial War Graves Commission in that post-Second World War world into becoming a Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So, and the change in the signs kind of heralded that as that moved forward. And very few of them survive now. There's a few in a private collection on the Somme. Imperial War Museum have got some, and there's a few up in Flanders Fields and at the War Graves Commission base depot in Arras. The vast majority disappeared. Some are in private collections. A friend of mine who's a collector sent me a picture of one that he has of Knightsbridge and Mesnal Ridge cemeteries on the Somme the other day. So they're kind of still out there. And then in the distance there, you can see, I say, that curve in the road. We mentioned Taff Gillingham, who was the advisor for the Sainsbury's advert. He's a little wooden cross indicating where him and the khaki chums dug into the field there in, what was it, 1999 or something. That's just up on the left-hand side of that bank. And then just beyond that is where that road turns, and that's kind of where you're very much in Bairnsfather country, overlooking that place where he was in the Christmas truce. And then the photographer went into Plug Street Wood. He probably followed that route from Prowse Point and the cemetery round to Mud Corner, the next cemetery, and then on into the wood itself. And this is one of the central rides of the wood, which shows a very different, it's a very dense wood today with the trees substantially bigger than this. And there's a large caliber shell sitting on the pathway there. So, in the 50s, it's interesting. There's not as much evidence, perhaps, of the iron harvest then. I don't know whether the kind of surface level shells had kind of been cleared to a certain degree, but obviously for him, this was something extraordinary that a live shell could still be there. It looks to be German. It could be a British 4.5, but I think it's a German 5.9. But it's slightly blurred, so I can't see the full details. But whatever, it's a bit of UXE, a bit of unexploded munitions. So um, it's still a problem. 50 years after this image was taken, it's perhaps even more of a problem to today in terms of just how cultivated the landscape is and how developed the landscape in Flanders is. More and more of this kind of stuff is being found every year. So we've come down into the southern sector. We're now going to retrace our steps and go east of Ypres now. And this is the Menin Road. We're on the Menin Road now. And there in the background is the Bellewaerde Ridge. And we're looking up to that ground just above Hoog and that wooded area. Some of you joined me on a battlefield walk there last year. And this is an area where there was intensive mining activity during the Great War. And that wooded area is absolutely packed with mine craters from 1915 through to 1917. And we're looking up the slopes where the 16th of June 1915 attack was made, where the trees are to the left part of the image. Those, it's not the wood itself replanted, but that's where Y Wood was located. And the Honourable Artillery Company and the Liverpool Scottish went up there. And there's that famous photograph taken by one of the Liverpool Scottish showing them in no man's land coming up to the German trenches with kind of line of men advancing and the trees of railway wood in the background. And that was all up there. So this is an interesting one because it shows the Menin Road is just a ordinary kind of country road. There's all houses along here now, so it's incredibly developed, very different kind of view. And slightly out of view to the right is Hoog Crater Museum as it is today, and the Hoog Crater Cemetery. And then he did go up onto the ridge itself because up on that ridge, very close, and we're actually looking into some of the mine craters between us and the cemetery there. So this is taken from the track looking towards the Royal Engineers grave, as it's called, where the trees are behind it. There's quite a big crater there. There's more to the right. And this was much more cratered ground then. When I first went there, you could see very clearly that there were craters all over the place. I found a German button actually just very close to where he must have taken this photograph. And there's the pathway going up to it. So this is a unique cemetery of the Great War. We often use that word to describe these different cemeteries, but some of them do have unique kind of aspects to them. This one does. No headstones. The men it commemorates are all from the 177 Tunnelling Company of the Royal Engineers killed beneath this ridge between 1915 and 1917 and are still buried in the mining tunnels in which they were fighting and digging and serving in that war underground. It's an absolutely fascinating cemetery that kind of opens our way to understanding that troglodyte nature of the First World War and the fight beneath the battlefield, of which, this is very much a kind of beacon to that, really. And again, although this is still a fairly wooded part of the battlefield, that is a very changed kind of view today. And then he went round into the middle of the Bellewaerde Farm woods and took this shot nicely framed with the track and the trees, looking straight back into Ypres. We can see the spires of Ypres in the distance. This hasn't changed much at all, except to the right now, there is the memorial to the Liverpool Scottish, who came up those slopes towards where we are, and you can get into the woods around it. Technically, I think he was trespassing when he took this, but I'm not sure he was that bothered. But it shows us again, quite an interesting view of this really important kind of epicenter of the fighting at Ypres, just east of Ypres, where the two curves of the salient met, and the men who were in the front line here, in the British and Commonwealth front line here, didn't just have the enemy in front of them, they had the enemy over to their right, over to their left as the ground curved around them, and if they looked behind them, to their right and to their left, the enemy were there as well. So they would have felt kind of surrounded on this part of the battlefield. An extraordinary kind of state of affairs. And then he moves up the road to Portesa, Pajitsi, and there he discovers a French cemetery, of which this is a shot of that. The French, I think, certainly one of the forgotten, lesser known, forgotten is so overused, but they are certainly perhaps one of the lesser appreciated nations that took part in the fighting in Flanders during the Great War. It wasn't just at the beginning. A lot of French troops came to Ypres during the First Battle of Ypres. French regular units, French colonial units, French territorials. They were fighting up at Dixmude at the same time, at Newport as well, alongside what was left of the Belgian army. And they stayed in the Ypres salient up until the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915, when they were very heavily involved in that. French colonial and territorial soldiers were at the kind of sharp end of the gas attack on the 22nd of April 1915. And perhaps many think, well, after that, the French left. Well, they did stay around in many sectors. When the diggers did their excavation at Bosing, and they found the remains of a French soldier there from the early summer of 1915. And just to the north of that, where the Yser Canal goes through a lock to a railway bridge, that was the kind of junction between the British sector and the next sector leading up to the coast, which was either Belgian troops there at different times or French troops as well. And in the approach to the Third Battle of Ypres in the summer of 1917, the French army sent troops up to take part in the attack there. And when the Guards Division attacked at Bosinger on their left flank, with French troops advancing towards Bixschooter and the ground beyond that northern, very northern part of what was the Pilkelm Ridge, kind of northeast of Bosinger village. And then the French returned in 1918 with a whole series of German offensives. The French army sent troops to the Somme in March, to Flanders in April, and of course, we're fighting alongside British and Commonwealth soldiers on the Chemin des Dames in May. But this cemetery reflects all of those years of the war that the French army was here, which is pretty much all of them, really, one way or another. 1916 would be an unusual year, I think, to see in this cemetery, because that's the year of the Battle of Verdun, when that's where the bulk, the concentration of the French army is focused on that fight at Verdun, that fight almost to the death. And this cemetery today is, again, we kind of talked about the natural world. It's not as well planted as this. It sometimes looks a little bit forlorn, I would say, on occasions, but nevertheless a really important cemetery, and important in our understanding of the global nature of the First World War, because there's metropolitan Frenchmen buried in here, but also men from many of France's colonies across the world as well. And we're coming to one of the villages, kind of northeast of Ypres now. This is the village of Wiltje, and this is just short of the front line. I mean, this village, pretty much, this image rather shows the village not having changed very much since it was rebuilt in the 1920s. This is a junction that's still there in the village. You go off to the left, that takes you on a road that goes straight into Ypres. This road goes to Ypres as well. Behind us on our right is Oxford Road Cemetery and the memorial to the 50th Northumbrian Division. And the front lines ran through the far end of the village from where he's photographed this. And this is the ground close to where the men of the 55th West Lancs Division made their attack on the 31st of July 1917, the opening day of the Third Battle of Ypres. And not far from here was Noel Chavasse, who was about to go into action and carry out a whole series of brave deeds that would result in the award of a bar to his Victoria Cross, sadly posthumously. Why he chose this particular village to photograph. Perhaps he liked the Friteur Georges on the left there. That's a chip shop. Perhaps he liked that. I don't know. But it's certainly, I think to me, it's a kind of timeless image. Although there's nothing apparent First World War on here, I kind of think it shows a timeless kind of Flemish village as they were, during that long, long period in which very few were visiting. And certainly when I look at this, I kind of see a world that he very much still was in the early 1980s when I went there. And then just up the road, he went to Buffs Road and he took quite a few pictures from Buffs Road Cemetery, but not one of the cemetery itself. This is one of the few that actually got a bit of the cemetery on it, which is the cemetery wall. And he's looking across the fields again, across ground that saw an advance on the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele. And across this ground on that day, the men of the 11th, 12th, and 13th Royal Sussex made their attack, the South Downs battalions. And we're looking up to a farm there, which was originally called Shell Trap Farm when the Canadians were here, and when it became part of the German front line, and this became where we're standing now, very close to the British front line, it was renamed Mousetrap Farm, and it was an area that had seen very heavy fighting in the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915. And of course, he couldn't make a visit to Ypres without visiting Tyne Cot. And again, this makes me, when we look at the weather in these images, although we know if you go to Flanders, the weather can be very variable, I have a feeling that these are pictures from a number of visits. This particular one, when he went to Tyne Cot, was a wet day, which you can see the kind of slick rain across the Portland stone paving in front of the shelters, and he's kind of taken his camera under the shelters to avoid, I guess, splash on the lens and so on. And again, we can see the kind of plantation of the cemetery, how there are a huge amount of shrubs and bushes and flowers on these graves. And it's a shame you can't kind of see the other way, because this is a time before chemicals were used to clean the headstones. And I would guess if we could get into that picture and look at those stones, we would probably see what we're seeing at the moment in the cemeteries, which is a very different view of what we have got kind of conditioned to see, which is clean, kind of virgin white headstones. And now, because they're not using chemicals to do that, we're seeing headstones that look a bit grubby. And I think if we could dive deep into these and see these, they probably would look the same. It's, I guess, a challenge for anyone to kind of keep stone outside in the kind of weather that they get in Flanders. And he's not moved much from his position here. He's kind of moved out a little bit. Perhaps the rain slackened off a bit, and he's got a shot looking down to the next shelter right across that central part of Tynecott Cemetery. Most people who come here today don't come as he would have done in through the front entrance. They come in via the back where the car park is. And this is a place where you see groups of people kind of congregating, trying to take in the sheer size of this cemetery, the largest British and Commonwealth cemetery from the Great War, with 11,500 burials and rows of headstones that just kind of keep going on, which I think he was trying to capture here. And it's interesting that he took these in a kind of portrait format rather than landscape. Whether he was trying to kind of show the positioning of the cemetery in relation to the landscape and the sky and how they're kind of all part of that, I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking that, but it's certainly interesting to take an image like that. Maybe he saw, looking from the shelters, as almost like a portal from the present to the past by looking at the graves of those who fell here during the Great War. But it's an image today that wouldn't be too dissimilar if you took this photograph. Slightly less trees, but certainly the kind of what we see, the flora and fauna that's in there, that goes very right back to what these cemeteries were all about, is still very much apparent. And then he went into Ypres itself, and he didn't photograph the last post. Maybe his camera kind of struggled with light in what was quite a dark subject to photograph without a tripod. But he got this shot of a local band on a particular fete day, kind of marching through the gate into the city of Ypres. So he's just outside where the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have their new visitor centre, which is just behind him to the right today. And then he went into the Menenstraat, the street leading up to the Menin Gate. And one or two of the buildings here have been demolished and replaced by modern ones. Essentially, it's the kind of same. And I'd kind of forgotten about this big almost kind of monastery looking, school building on the right there, which is now a restaurant. It shows again kind of how much of the old Ypres, the pre-First World War Ypres, was restored even in the side streets. Because I think if you look at some of the pre-war images, pre-First World War images of Ypres, many of these buildings are absolutely identical to what were there before 1914. And it's a festival period, and we can see Ypres being used on the sign hanging up above the street there, reflecting how in this period that he was here in the 50s and 60s, with that growth of Flemish nationalism, Ypres was no longer Ypres, it was now Ypres, and the Flemish language, the Flemish dialect was recognised in the way that it should always have been, as the language, the first language of the people who live in this region of Belgium. And I just kind of zoomed in on that as well, so we can see that a little bit better. We're looking down through the Menin Gate there. Again, a kind of timeless view, in so many different ways, quite like the 2CV that's coming up the street towards us there. And then he went into the main square and he photographed the square. I mean, this is standing on that corner. The Novotel Hotel is to the left, and you've got that beautiful view of the buildings, the cloth hall and the cathedral behind, kind of almost going back to where we started with that pre-war postcard in the 1910s, showing the cloth hall in those years before the Great War. It's now been restored, and that beautiful medieval building has been risen like a phoenix from the ashes of the destruction of the Great War, and it sits there important and magnificent once more. And I think, even today, it's something I've said a lot in the last couple of years when I've been here with groups. There's a message of hope there for modern times, because the kind of destruction that we saw in those early images is taking place right now on the other side of Europe. And one day, although it's be impossible for many of those people to imagine a future without that, without war, communities can recover, can rebuild, and these magnificent buildings can return. And I think that's part of the wider impact of images like this and what they show. And then he went up the tower of the cloth hall and he took this shot looking back down towards the Menin Gate and beyond to the battlefields. And again, it's a less crowded landscape, a more countrified landscape than it is today. There has been a lot of development at Ypres in recent decades, and then certainly in the 4 or more decades since I've been going there. And again, I've zoomed in on this one so we can see the gate quite clearly, and the main area of the square there, and just how rural that landscape is. There's a kind of timelessness again to this, really, because the Menin Gate is now approaching its centenary, as standing there again as a kind of guardian, that gateway, that portal to the landscape of the First World War, just as the gate was that exit out of Ypres for the troops marching up to the front line. I think it acts as that gateway for the pilgrims, the visitors to the old front line today, to make their way onto the battlefield. And it will always, I hope it will always represent that in so many ways. And this is what, 10, 15 years after the Second World War. And we've got to remember, when we look at this landscape here and the buildings of the city of Ypres, it wasn't destroyed like it had been in the First World War, but it was damaged. I think it's over 700, 800 buildings within the city of Ypres were damaged by German artillery or bombs in May of 1940. And gradually that has been recovered and repaired, although even today on many of these buildings we can see signs of that World War II battle damage. So that's the end of his images, and I just wanted to kind of round it off at the end with a nod of the kind of continuation of that. He took these 28, 29 images that we've looked at in the 1950s and 60s, and within the next decade, John Giles, who's in the centre of that group of First World War veterans, with Clary Jarman on the left there, and John Giles in the middle, the founder of the Western Front Association, on a very early WFA tour. I didn't take this photograph. This is one of John Giles's images that his wife, Marjorie, very kindly gave me after he died in the early 1990s. He was a very accomplished photographer himself. We don't know the name of our friend who took those previous images, but John took a whole series of images. which are not dissimilar to the ones that our friend took that we've seen in this talk for the very first time. And again, these are some examples of those Imperial War Graves Commission signs, in this case at Lone Tree Cemetery near to, well, at Spanbrook Moorland. So it says to Lone Tree Crater. That's what that's kind of up towards where Spanbrook Moorland is located. And the Lone Tree Crater sign remained there up until the early 2000s when a tractor hit it and it disappeared. Where it is now, I have no idea. And then John took this image, and again, I think I've shown you this before, but this appears in his Eat Then and Now book. It's at the Menin Road. We had that image of the Menin Road at Hellfire Corner in 1917 at the very beginning of the talk, with the Australians and the mules and the horses coming down the road. This is almost on exactly the same spot, an image that John took in the late 60s, early 70s, with a Belgian gendarme standing on the left-hand side of the image next to the demarcation stone at Hellfire Corner. Over to the right, I can see another one of these Imperial War Graves Commission signs for the cemeteries. That kind of strange flat-roofed building is there that was close to the railway crossing, where the railway tracks have been torn up. So this is after that railway was decommissioned, but it still shows the Menin Road as this straight road heading across that landscape. That again, that part of that gateway, that pathway to the history of the Great War, which we spoke about in a recent podcast about the Menin Road. And I guess this is kind of where I bring this to a conclusion, because it brings this story, certainly for me, kind of full circle. Because just as our friend walked down this Menin Road, photographed the ground beyond it, John Giles did that in the decades that followed, I did exactly the same in the decades that followed John Giles. So this is one of my photographs from my first visit here in 1982, looking down that Menin Road. There's that flat top building on the right hand side, changed somewhat, no signs of the railway crossing at all. The demarcation stone where the gendarme was standing is where our school minibus is sitting there. Demarcation stone had been moved slightly. It must have been moved, I don't know how many times over the years. But this was the beginning of, I guess, of my journey across this landscape, telling these stories, understanding what happened here, and something that, I hope to continue to do for many, many years to come, and talk about it with you guys on talks like this, and of course on that podcast, and forever remaining fascinated by this landscape of the old front line.